At some point, maybe you, maybe your parents, maybe your grandparents, someone in your family made a decision to come here to the United States. And that decision was not random. It wasn't arbitrary. People don't, uproot their lives, leave the people they love, cross the border, learn a new language, start all over again for no reason at all. They do it because they're making a calculation. Consciously or not, the life available here they're calculating is better than the life available there. Not perfect, but better. And that calculation, that decision to move towards something and away from something else, that's data. Okay, it's what researchers call a behavioral revealed preference measure. The behavior is revealing your preference, which is a technical way of saying when you watch what people actually do with their feet, when the choice is real, you learn something more honest than you would in any survey. Surveys tell you what people say they believe. Behavior tells you what they actually believe. Last lecture, I asked what you believe that you refuse to examine. Today is where that question gets answered, not for your personal life, but at the largest scale human beings have really ever attempted to answer it. We're going to examine the most ambitious social experience in recorded history. An experiment that asked, can you build a better society by redesigning the rules from the ground up? Can you replace the system that exists with something more just, more equal, more humane? And those are good questions, right? They're not stupid questions. They're the right questions. And the people who asked them weren't stupid people. And the answers, measured in numbers, in testimony, and in some cases the physical bodies of human beings, are what we're going to examine today. And this is not a historical question. Right now in this country, there's a serious and growing political movement that argues that the U.S. should move away from what we currently have now, which is market capitalism, towards something more like socialism or communism. So polling in a few years back found that 51% of Americans between the ages of 18 and 30 saw socialism favorably. And a government survey by YouGov the following year, 2019, found that 70% of millennials said they would vote for a socialist presidential candidate. So these aren't marginal, sideline positions. On many college campuses, they're really the default position for students as well as many professors. I'm not telling you this to argue for or against it. I'm telling you this because you're living inside this debate right now, whether you realize it or not. And you deserve and need to be able to evaluate it the way we've been learning to evaluate everything in this course, not through, inherited beliefs, not through what feels right before you look at the evidence, through the evidence itself. So some of you came from countries where versions of this experiment have already been run. Some of you have family members who lived it. Some of you are maybe hearing about it for the first time as, this weird political idea, which is the way most Americans encounter it, as a theory, not as a reality that you had to navigate. So wherever you're starting from, what I'm asking you to do today is the same thing. Set aside what you already believe just for the length of this lecture and follow the evidence. That is what intellectual honesty looks like in practice. So we have a procedure for evaluating competing claims. We have been building it for weeks in this class. So today we're applying it to the biggest competing claims of the 20th century. So most things we test in psychology involve a few dozen college students, a controlled lab setting, and a margin of error that makes everyone a little nervous. So we try to control for variables, we try to eliminate confounds, we try to replicate, and we still argue constantly about whether our findings are real or right. Communism which is basically the same as socialism, so we're going to just stick with communism here. It's one of the most extensively tested political and economic theories in human history. So it was implemented at massive scale across multiple continents and countries in radically different cultures over nearly a century. It made specific falsifiable predictions about what would happen, that collective ownership would prove abundance, that class conflict would resolve, that human well-being would improve. So these aren't vague claims, they're not vague aspirations, they're concrete claims about how human societies would function under specific conditions. So we have data, real data from real places involving hundreds of millions of real people, not a simple survey with a 4-point Likert scale. We have the entire 20th century as our experiment. So we're going to treat it like any other hypothesis so that you can learn hypothesis testing with something real in life. Us professors are always being accused of teaching things that don't apply to real life. So this is about as real as it could get. So we're going to define our variables, we're going to name our confounds, we're going to evaluate the evidence, and if the data takes us somewhere uncomfortable, we're still going to follow it. And if you can do it with one of the most charged political topics of the last 100 years, you can certainly do it with anything. You already live in a capitalist society. You have your whole life, but most people have never had the actual mechanics of capitalism explained. You may never have even heard the term. So we're going to build it from the ground up using something concrete, something that you might have experienced in your life, something very simple. Let's say you decide to sell tamales. So you go to the store, you spend $20 on masa, pork, chilies, corn husks. You spend a Saturday making 50 tamales. You sell them for $2 each. You made $100. After your $20 in costs, you have $80 left. That $80 is what we call profit. So the difference between what you put in and what you got out, right? And here's the first key feature of capitalism. That $80 is yours, minus what the government takes from you in taxes. But you keep it. Nobody besides the government takes it from you. Nobody decides what you do with it, okay? So now let's say business is good. You sell tamales every weekend for a year. You save up $2,000. You use it to buy a cart, a proper setup with a warmer and a canopy. So now you have a cart. That cart is yours. You own it. In the language of economics, you own the means of production, the means of producing more tamales, the physical thing that allows you to produce and sell your goods, to sell your tamales. So that phrase, the means of production, that's really important today. Under capitalism, individuals can own the means of production. You don't just own your shoes and your phone. You can own the factory, the farm, the delivery truck, the tamale cart. Your business keeps growing, so you can't run the cart alone. So you hire your cousin. You pay her, $15 an hour. So she shows up, makes tamales, serve customers, and at the end of the day, you pay her and she goes home. So that is wage labor, the arrangement where most people in a capitalist economy participate. They don't own a factory or a farm or the tamale cart. They sell their time and skills to someone who does in exchange for wages, okay, wage labor. And roughly 93% of us Americans are wage laborers. So one Saturday, let's say you notice the taqueria 2 blocks over raised their prices. Tamales there are now $3, and they still have a line out the door. So you raise your prices too, right? You charge, let's say, $2.50, and sales don't drop. And so you just made money for the same work. You raise it to $3, sales don't drop. Great. You raise it to $3.50, and now you have less customers, so you drop it back down to $3. Okay? Nobody told you to raise or lower your prices. Nobody gave you permission. You watched what was happening around you, and you responded. This is the market, the system through which prices emerge from the interaction of buyers and sellers without any central authority, without any, the government or the tamale boss or whoever telling you what to do and setting those prices. When a lot of people want something and there's not a lot of it, prices go up. When something is, all over the place, is very common and not a lot of people want it, the price of it goes down. So the market coordinates this automatically through just millions of individual decisions without anybody being in charge of coordinating that. And underneath all of this is the profit motive, the fact that you're doing this because you want to make money, not because someone told you to, not because you feel like you have a duty to fill every belly with tamales and make sure that people aren't hungry, because you want to keep the profit, you want some money, right? So that self-interest is not treated as a flaw in capitalism. Selfishness is okay in capitalism because it's the engine that motivates people to do things, okay? And you're motivated to do things that help other people out. When you want to make money, it helps them, great, okay, win-win. But capitalism does not promise equality. It produces and maybe even requires inequality. The person who owns the factory or the tamale cart and the person who works at it, they're not in the same position. So some businesses grow into empires, others fail. Some people get huge amounts of wealth, most people don't. And that unevenness, the unevenness between that's not accidental. It's the structure of capitalism. And some people take exception to that. And that's exactly what a young German philosopher was looking at in the 1840s when he decided that this whole system that we call capitalism needed to be replaced. So before we examine the alternative to capitalism, I need to show you what capitalism has actually produced. You can't evaluate a proposed replacement without understanding what you're proposing to replace. That's not a political statement, that's basic research design. So capitalism is the null hypothesis. So what does the null hypothesis say? So in 1820, approximately 84% of the world's population was living in extreme poverty. They couldn't afford basic food, minimal shelter, minimal clothing. 84%. Not in isolated pockets, but everywhere, including Europe, including what would become the United States. This wasn't a crisis. This was just the default human condition. Everybody lived this way across all of recorded history. Today, on the other hand, the World Bank and the UN estimate that approximately 9 to 10% of the world's population lives in extreme poverty. So from 84% all the way down to 10% in 2 centuries. That's miraculous. And that trajectory began to accelerate sharply around 1800, which is when market economies, or capitalism, began to industrialize at scale. Global average life expectancy in 1900 was approximately 32 years old. Today, it's 73 years old. Child mortality in 1800, the percentage of children dying before age 5 was about 43%. Today, it's down to 4%. Global literacy in 1820 was 12%, and today it's gone up all the way to 87%. These are measurements from the World Bank, the United Nations, peer-reviewed economic history. They all follow the same trajectory. They're flat across most of human history and then bending sharply upward beginning around the Industrial Revolution, which is also when market economies, capitalism, began operating at scale. So to put those numbers in human terms, in 1800, if you had a child, there was nearly a 1 in 2 chance, a 50% chance that child would die before their 5th birthday. Today, that chance is closer to 1 in 25. In 1900, the average human being lived to about 32 years old. Today, the average is 73. So these aren't small improvements. They're the difference between a world where most children bury their parents young and a world where most parents bury no children at all. Does capitalism get full credit for all of this? No. Medicine, sanitation, governance, education all contributed, although there's certainly an argument that capitalism helped all of those fields to do better. And the early industrial period produced some genuine issues, brutality, child labor, lethal working conditions, really extreme inequality. These were real, and the people who suffered them had every right to be angry. And it's precisely that anger that produced the periods and places where market economies, where capitalism operated, correlate with the most dramatic improvements in human welfare ever recorded. This is the null hypothesis. Not perfection, okay, but a documented track record that the alternative must beat. Karl Marx was a German philosopher and economist writing in the mid-1800s. He worked with a guy named Friedrich Engels, and together they published the Communist Manifesto in 1848, also called Das Kapital. Marx looked at industrial capitalism in the 1840s and 1850s, and, he saw what was genuinely there. The Industrial Revolution was generating more wealth than had ever existed in human history, and most of it was flowing to a small number of factory owners, while workers, men, women, and children, were working in conditions we would today call slavery, or maybe slavery adjacent. So 12-hour days or more, sometimes 16, 18, 20-hour days, 6 days a week, dangerous machinery, no protections, wages that were barely sufficient to survive. So Marx asked a question that is still worth asking. Why? The economy is producing more than ever. Why are the people doing the producing so poor? And his answer was because of how ownership works. Go back to the tamale cart. You sell a tamale for $2. The ingredients cost 20 cents. You pay your cousin 50 cents per tamale in labor. Your tamale costs 70 cents total to make, and you sell it for $2. You keep $1.30. Now, scale that up to a factory. A worker spends an hour making a product that sells for $50. The raw materials cost 10. The workers paid 8. The factory owner keeps 32. Not because the owner worked harder necessarily, or contributed more skill to making that specific product, but because the owner owns the factory. The owner took the risk, the owner put out the investment, the owner's in control. All right, sorry for the unscheduled interruption. So anyhow, Marx called this surplus value. That's the gap between what a worker produces and what a worker is paid. And he argued that this gap isn't accidental, it's the entire mechanism of capital. So profit comes from somewhere, it comes from paying workers less than the value they create. And the system is designed to produce this gap. You can't reform it away, according to him, because it's not a malfunction. It is the function. And workers can't escape the arrangement. They have two choices: accept the wages offered by whoever owns the means of production, or don't work, and therefore don't eat. So the labor contract looks like a free agreement between equals, but Marx argued that it's coercion dressed up in kind of like legal language. So real freedom would require having alternatives. And when the only alternative to accepting an employer's term is starvation, you're not free, you're desperate. So his answer for this followed logically from, his diagnosis. If the problem is private ownership of the means of production, then eliminate private ownership of the means of production. Factories, farms, tamale carts belong to everyone collectively. Everybody owns it. So, and then a central authority runs production that's in the interest of everyone. So the class structure that makes this sort of exploitation possible doesn't exist anymore. Eventually, the state itself, the theory is that it would wither away and you wouldn't need it anymore. So there'd be no more owners, no more workers, just human beings contributing what they can and receiving what they need. So his most concise statement of this is his quote, "From each according to his abilities, to each according to his needs." So you contribute what you can, you receive what you need, not what you can afford, not what the market says your labor is worth, but what you actually need to live a full human life. So I want to pause here and ask you honestly, does that sound appealing? Most people say yes, and that's probably the right reaction. The suffering Marx described was real. The children working in mines were real. The workers dying of preventable injuries in factories with no safety regulations was real. The intuition that a society producing so much wealth shouldn't leave so many people unable to feed their families, that intuition is correct, and Marx saw it clearly. The question isn't whether he was right that something was wrong. He was. The question is whether what he built to fix it actually fixed it, or did it make everything worse? And that is what we're about to find out through the process of hypothesis testing. Before we look at data, we need to do one more thing, a testability audit. So we have to go through each claim and ask, can this be falsified? Can we gather evidence that would prove it wrong? A theory that can never be proven wrong isn't science. It's a worldview, it's a religion, it's an ideology. There was a philosopher named Karl Popper who talked about this exact problem, and he noticed that certain intellectual movements could always interpret any observation as confirmation of their belief. So if a patient got better, that confirmed the theory. If they got worse, that was resistance. This was psychoanalysis that he was looking at. And so no matter what you do in psychoanalysis, if you get better, then it's because the theory's great. And if you got worse, then the theory says you're resisting the therapist, which also confirms the theory. So no outcome was ever evidence against it. Popper called this a fatal flaw. It wasn't a sign of strength of a theory. A theory that can explain everything predicts nothing. He proposed the criterion of falsifiability. A theory is scientific if and only if it makes predictions that could, in principle, be proven wrong. It has to stick its nose out, right? It has to stick its neck out. If I'm right, then this specific thing should happen. And if it doesn't, I'm wrong. Now, before we begin, I want to address something directly because at the end of this lecture, after you've seen the evidence, you're very likely to encounter a specific response. You may have already heard it. You may have thought it yourself. That wasn't real communism. So ask yourself, what would real communism look like? This is what people say all the time with communism whenever anything goes wrong with it. It wasn't real communism. So what would real communism look like? What specific prediction does it make? What evidence would falsify it? If the answer is that no possible outcome could ever count as a failure, if every bad result can always be blamed on something, on corrupt leaders, on Western interference, on, not enough commitment to communism, then notice what you've done. You've made the communist hypothesis unfalsifiable. You've designed it so that nothing could ever count as evidence against it. That's not intellectual honesty. That's a belief protected from contact with reality, just like Salem did with the witch trials, right? So we call this by its name, which is post hoc redefinition. Post hoc it's Latin for after the thing. So we redefine it afterwards. Whenever we see something against communism, we just redefine what communism actually is, and that's bad science. So consider what we're about to examine. We're going to look at the Soviet Union as well as North and South Korea. So the Soviet Union existed under 5 different leaders across 70 years. We'll look at China under Mao, Cuba, North Korea, Cambodia, Vietnam, Ethiopia, Venezuela, different continents, different cultures, different leaders, different historical circumstances. We're not looking at just one experiment. We're looking at dozens of independent replications, which is good science. In psychology, if a treatment fails or passes across 20 independent replications in different labs with different researchers, we don't conclude that, if they failed, that all 20 were defective. We conclude that the hypothesis is probably wrong, right? So the same standard applies here. If we see failure across all these replications, then it must be wrong. If we see success across all these replications, it must be right. Okay? 20 different independent replications is very significant science. So when researchers want to test whether something causes an outcome, the gold standard is a randomized controlled experiment. Take a group of people, randomly assign half to one condition, half to another, measure the difference. Random assignment is what makes it work. It ensures that the two groups are equivalent in every way except for the thing you're testing, the variable you're testing. So any difference in outcome can be attributed to that thing and nothing else. We obviously can't randomly assign countries to economic systems, okay? But history, in a few very remarkable cases, actually did something very close to that for us. Germany is one example of that. So May 8th, 1945, Germany surrenders. The Nazis are conquered. The country is in ruins. They have over 160 major cities that are bombed, millions of people dead. The infrastructure of what was a very modern nation was reduced to rubble. And the Allied powers, which is like America, England, France, and Russia, or the USSR at the time, divided Germany into occupation zones. So basically the West owned half and the USSR owned the other half, basically. So by 1949, 4 years after the war, there were 2 German states that existed, West Germany and East Germany. So West Germany was the American English version of market capitalism, democracy. East Germany was central planning and communism. So it's the same country, it's the same people, the same language, the same culture, the same history, the same religion, the same educational traditions, the same total devastation as the starting point, the same level of industrial base, which wasn't a lot because it was mostly destroyed, same geographic resources, divided in half. And in the case of the city of Berlin, divided by a literal wall. That city was divided in half, and the communists put a wall down the middle of it to keep the population divided. And so the division was entirely a product of which army happened to occupy which zone at the end of the war. It had nothing to do with any difference between the people on either side of the line. So that is the definition of experimental control. This is perfect for as close as we can get to a randomized control experiment. When we compare the outcomes in East and West Germany, 40 years later, we can attribute the difference to the economic system with much more confidence than we could from any simple country-to-country comparison. So this is what researchers call a natural experiment, a situation where where historical circumstances create something close to experimental condition, not by design, but purely by accident, purely by kind of nature, okay, the nature of history. All right, so let's look at the first communist claim, the first hypothesis that we're going to look at. So the communist claim, stated in its strongest and most compelling form, we're going to be fair to both sides. Communism doesn't just claim to be more just, more right and correct and fair than market capitalism. It claims to produce better lives, right? So a rational scientific authority that is not looking at, it's the distortions of profit and self-interest, coordinates production and distribution better than price signals, than the self-interest, selfishness of price and money and everything that's in capitalism. Okay, so goods go to those who need them in communism. No one goes without because they can't afford it. That's what communism claims. No one accumulates huge amounts of wealth while other people starve, and the result is that human welfare across the whole population is higher than capitalism can achieve. That is the claim that communism makes about people's lives. Not just, economic efficiency or whatever, but whether actual human beings are being fed, housed, healthy, able to live fully. So our first test of that claim, what you have to look at is how are you going to operationalize this? What variables do you look at to say that people are doing better, that people are fed, housed, healthy, able to live fully? So one of them is economic output, right? That would be a really simple one to look at. What's the GDP of the countries? It's not perfect for human welfare, and we're going to look at that limitation, but it's the most widely available, the most widely used, the most comparable data that we have. So we'll start there and then we'll push it a little bit further. So the formal hypothesis, this is step one that you have to do. What is your hypothesis? That's step one of hypothesis testing. So the null hypothesis, what we have now is that capitalism, market economies, same thing as capitalism, produces a certain level of human welfare, and communism doesn't outperform it. Okay, so capitalism is great. It's what we have now. We've seen that it has produced really good outcomes. There's definitely been some benefits. The alternative, that's the null. The alternative claim is that communism does it better. Okay, so that's what we're testing. Is the alternative what we want to go with or not? So before we continue running the 5 steps, I need to explain something that is often taken for granted. So it's in this argument, it's something that's so embedded in daily life that it's almost invisible. What do prices actually do? Because the communist claim depends on a specific argument about prices, and you can't evaluate that argument without understanding what prices are actually for. So you walk into a grocery store, there's 40,000 different products on the shelves: tomatoes from Mexico, cheese from Wisconsin, coffee from Colombia, shampoo, battery, bread, medicine, cooking oil, thousands of items, sourced from dozens of countries, available to you right there on the shelf. So who decided all that would be there? Nobody, right? That's the answer. Nobody sat in a room and planned the inventory of that store. What happened instead is something that sort of happens invisibly and automatically. So, a coffee farmer, for instance, in Colombia noticed that the price of coffee was high enough that growing it was worth his effort. And then a shipping company noticed that transporting coffee to the United States was profitable. And a store manager noticed that customers kept buying coffee and running out of stock, so he ordered more. So at no point did any of these people communicate with each other or coordinate their decisions, or nobody told them, what to buy or how much to buy. They each responded independently to one thing: prices. The prices told each of them independently whether what they were doing was worth doing. And the result, somehow, is that coffee shows up on the shelf every week in a store you've never thought about, supplied by people you've never met at a price that reflects the cost of growing it in Colombia, shipping it across an ocean, roasting it, distributing, getting onto a shelf, within driving distance of your house. Okay, or to Amazon within driving distance of your house. So this is what price actually does. It carries information. When something's scarce and many people want it, the price rises, which simultaneously tells producers to make more and tells consumers to use less. And when something is abundant and not a lot of people want it, the price falls. Nobody has to understand the whole system. Each individual just responds to the prices in front of them, and the result is this amazing coordination across millions of people who've never met each other and probably never will. Okay, this is often called by Adam Smith, who's wrote a really important book about capitalism. It's called The Invisible Hand. Okay, there's an invisible hand that's directing all of this. Now, here's the question Marx was asking. Okay, and I want you to hear it as a genuine question because it does point to something real. In a market economy, in capitalism, your ability to send a signal through the price system depends on your purchasing power. So a wealthy person who wants a 4th vacation home and a poor person who needs medicine for their kid both enter the market, but the wealthy person's signal is louder, right? They have more money. The market responds to it first, faster, more fully. Okay? The market can't distinguish between a want and a need. It just responds to purchasing power. So a child needs medicine and can't afford it. Her family's demand for that medicine is real, Okay, it's a biological fact, but it doesn't register as strongly in the market because there's no money behind it. On the other side of town, a wealthy person wants, a luxury car, which is not a need, it's just what they want, but they have substantial purchasing power. So the market serves the wealthy person, and the child maybe goes without medicine. The market did exactly what it was designed to do. It just turned out that demand and need aren't the same thing. And Marx looked at this and said, the price system is not a neutral information mechanism, right? It's a mechanism that favors purchasing power over human need. So what we need to do is replace prices with logical decision making about what people need, that some central authority decides rather than all of these individual millions of people around the world deciding prices together. So this central authority can make decisions based on what people actually need rather than what they can pay for, and then you'll produce a more just and more efficient economy with those better health outcomes, with those better life outcomes that Marx predicts. It will be a better economy. And it's not an unreasonable argument, right? It has logical coherence. It's something real. The question is whether replacing prices with central planning actually fixes this. It's not saying that there isn't a problem, that there is a problem with capitalism in this. But does communism actually fix this is what we're asking in hypothesis testing. This is logical, rational decision making, okay? So does it fix it or does it trade it for a worse problem? And to understand that, I need to show you what happens when you try to plan a complex economy without prices. Okay. So in a market economy, how does a shoe factory know how many shoes to make? What sizes, what styles, what colors? The factory doesn't know, not in advance. It makes an educated guess, produces a range of shoes, puts them in stores, watches what happens. If size 8 sells out every week, the stores reorder. The factory sees increased demand and shifts production towards size 8, right? If brown Oxford shoes sit on the shelf for months because nobody likes those anymore, the price drops, the factory discounts them, and they stop producing them. They start shifting production to what actually sells. So the factory learns from continuous feedback, from the market real-time signal about what people are actually choosing to buy. Now imagine you're a central planner. Your job is to decide how many shoes to make for the entire country, what sizes, what styles, for 150 million people. You don't have a price signal telling you what's selling and isn't. You have reports filled out by factory managers who know that admitting they haven't met their quota has consequences. So reports filled out by regional supervisors who know that their supervisor wants good news about how much is selling, how much is being produced. And reports that travel up through layers of bureaucracy towards, Moscow, for instance, get slightly more optimistic at each level because everyone in the chain has an incentive to tell the one above them what they want to hear, because otherwise you might be killed. So by the time the report reaches the central planners, it might only bear a partial relationship to what's actually happening in the shoe store. Step 1, state the hypotheses. So before we run a single calculation, we have to make 3 decisions explicit. What are we measuring? Who are we comparing? And what exactly are we predicting? This matters more than it might seem. One of the most common errors in research and in political arguments that pretend to be based on evidence is deciding what you predicted after you've already seen the results. That post hoc redefinition. So the whole point of stating the hypotheses first is to commit to a prediction before the data is in front of you. Otherwise, you can always, reconstruct a story later on that makes you look right, makes your conclusion look inevitable. So step 1 is the discipline that prevents that. So what are we measuring? We are measuring economic output per worker, GDP per capita, gross domestic product per head, literally, or per person. That is the total value of all goods and services that a country produces in a year divided by its population. It's an imperfect measure of human welfare, and we'll say more about that later on and test some other things, but it is the most consistently measured, most widely available, the most typical economic indicator that we have. And it tracks directly with what communism claimed to improve, the material conditions, the physical condition of ordinary people's lives. Now, who are we comparing? Population 1, communism, right? Specifically, economies that have eliminated price signals and replaced them with the government-directed allocation of resources. The government decides who gets what. And we're going to particularly look at East Germany for this because it's such a great natural experiment, okay? So this is an economy where a central authority decides what gets produced in what quantities and who gets it. Population 2 is capitalism, market economies using price coordination. So economies where, the price emerges from the interaction of buyers and sellers and producers respond to price signals rather than someone telling them what to do. And in this case, we're going to look at West Germany, as well as other capitalist economies throughout Europe, which is the closest fair countries to compare to. So that distinction matters, right? We're not comparing rich countries to poor countries or Western countries to Eastern ones or countries with different histories and cultures. We're comparing 2 specific mechanisms of economic organization. The natural experiments that we have, which is Germany, that divided in 1945, gives us populations that are matched on everything except one variable. Same people, same culture, same starting point, simply a different economy. Now, the hypotheses. So the null hypothesis is that capitalism produces welfare outcomes at least as good as communism. So any difference that you see is just by chance. It's not because communism is better. The alternative hypothesis, H1, is that communism produces superior, much better human welfare outcomes compared to capitalism because it eliminates exploitation, it allocates resources according to people's needs rather than purchasing power, and it kind of frees human motivation from the distortions of capitalism. Right? So that's the hypothesis. So unless the null hypothesis is wrong, and communism is better, we wouldn't go with an alternative hypothesis. That's the way null and alternative hypotheses work. So in symbols, you'll see that the null hypothesis HO, you got the mean 1 is less than or equal to mean 2. Okay, so communism performs no better than capitalism. And for the alternative hypothesis, mean 1 is better. It's greater than mean 2. So communism outperforms capitalism. So notice that H1, the alternative hypothesis, is a high direction prediction. So we are predicting that central planning will land above market economies in the right tail of the comparison distribution. This is a one-tail test. Some people might write H1, the alternative, as a prediction of failure, communism underperforming. That frame is tempting if you already expect the null hypothesis to hold, that capitalism will do better. If you are pro-capitalism, this is how you might want to frame it, but it's not the honest framing. It puts the burden of proof on the critics of communism rather than on the proponents of communism. And it allows a rhetorical escape. If the data confirms our prediction of failure, a defender of communism can always say that capitalists were just looking for failure. So the honest framing is to state the alternative claim in its strongest form. So to state the communist claim in its strongest form as H1, exactly what the proponents of communism assert. And then test whether the evidence supports it, okay? So make sure that when you're framing hypotheses, you're doing it honestly and not in a biased fashion. So if the data fails to support the alternative, then you falsified the claim that the proponents of communism are actually making, okay? You've tested what they said. This also correctly identifies what capitalism is doing in this test, right? It's not the hypothesis, it's the null, it's the established baseline, the default position, the system with an existing track record. Communism is the challenger making the claim of something different, and the challenger bears the burden of proof in critical thinking. That's how critical thinking, logical thought is set up. That's the process of logical thought. Now notice what will happen when the data comes in, okay? If centrally planned economies show superior outcomes, we reject the null. Okay, that's how we say it. We reject the null. We reject capitalism. The communist claim is supported when we reject capitalism. If they show equivalent outcomes, so they're the same, then we retain the null. The claim of communism being better is unconfirmed. We might as well stick with capitalism, with what we already have. Okay, so that's the way it works. If you don't reject the alternative, then you retain the null. You just stick with the null. But if they show inferior outcomes, and so communism is worse than capitalism, that the data hasn't merely failed to support the alternative, it hasn't merely failed to support communism in this case, it's landed in the exact opposite tail from the one that communism, that H1, hypothesis 1, predicted. The claim predicted high, they predicted they'd outperform capitalism, but the data landed low, and they underperformed capitalism. And that would be a stronger result than simply failing to reach significant. It means the hypothesis wasn't just unconfirmed, it was actually contradicted. Okay. So one more thing, notice that H1 states the mechanism and not just the direction. So central planning will produce superior outcomes because of these reasons, because it eliminates exploitation, because it meets people's needs better, etc. So the causal mechanism is what makes this a genuine scientific hypothesis rather than just a guess. A mechanism is falsifiable, and remember with Karl Popper how important that is for a theory to be falsifiable. So you can imagine evidence that you could look at that might contradict it. If the mechanism of how it works is wrong, if, for example, the information system required for communism, required to feed back with the information as opposed to using pricing as information, if that can't function honestly under real institutional conditions, or if individual incentives turn out to matter, more than ideology, then that predicted superior outcome won't appear. Okay, so anyhow, the point is that the mechanism, knowing the why of the hypothesis or the how of the hypothesis, makes specific predictions. So this makes it a better hypothesis testing, a better experiment. Okay, and we're going to test some of them. There's a lot more that we could test, but this is already a long enough lecture. Okay, so step 2. Comparison distribution. So before we look at any East German data, we have to build a picture of what the world would look like if the null hypothesis were true. If economic organization, capitalism versus communism, made no difference at all to the output. Okay. So this picture is called the comparison distribution. Think of it as a reference frame. If there are no real difference between these two economic systems, then East Germany's economic performance would be somewhere around the center of the picture, the average of the other countries. So roughly average amongst comparable economies. If the alternative, H1, is correct, if communism genuinely produces superior outcomes economically, then East Germany's score should land in the extreme right tail, well above center. So you'd have it somewhere up here, right? So it would be in a region higher than the average. So, and this is what the communist claim predicts, right? Not just an equal performance, but an outperformance of these other economies, the capitalist economies. So the comparison distribution that we're using here is built from the GDP per capita data across comparable Western European market economies in 1989, which is the year before communism collapsed, the USSR collapsed, and Germany reunified, okay, when the Berlin Wall fell and all that good stuff, which is 40 years after East and West Germany divided. So East Germany started from the same baseline as West Germany in 1945, right? And by 1989, we're asking where did it land relative to market economies it was supposed to surpass? Is it equal? Is it better? Is it worse? Okay, so two numbers define the distribution. The mu, which is $22,000. Mu, again, is the Greek letter we use for mean. It's the center of the distribution. This is the average GDP per capita across comparable Western European market economies in 1989. So a score exactly at 22,000 or around 22,000 would mean East Germany performed exactly as well as the average market economy at that time period. That would be consistent with the null, right? No differences. It would support the null. To support hypothesis 1, East Germany needs to land above the center to the right. All right, so we've got the mean, which is 22,000. What's the deviation? How much do these economies vary? And this, which would be the sigma, which would be the standard deviation. The standard deviation, I've already calculated this for you so you don't have to do it, is $3,500. It's not a big deviation amongst these countries, okay? That's pretty standard to have an average GDP per capita at this time of 22,000. People didn't make a lot of money at this time, okay? So again, sigma is the standard deviation, how spread out the scores are around the mean. So one standard deviation above the mean is 25,500. One standard deviation below is 18,500. That's where most people fall, okay? Remember the empirical rule, okay? 68% of people fall in that first standard deviation. So the shape of this distribution is normal. You can see that. A bell curve. Scores cluster near the center, become increasingly rare as you move further from the mean in either direction. So again, you've got your 68% of people falling in that first standard deviation, 18,500 to 25,500. That's the 3,500 range. And then 95% falling between 15,000 and 29,000, two standard deviations, and that's almost everybody. Almost everybody is between 15,000 and 29,000. And then almost literally everybody is within three standard deviations, so 11,500 to 32,500, okay? So now hold that last number, right, the 32,500. A GDP per capita above 32,500 would be more than three standard deviations above the mean, right? Fewer than 3 in 1,000 capitalist economies land that far above average by chance. That's what the alternative needs, is East Germany landing in that region, demonstrating that communism produces outcomes superior that chance couldn't explain the gap, okay? It's so superior that it couldn't be because of chance. A GDP per capita below 11,500, three standard deviation, that would be more than three standard deviations below the mean. Fewer than 3 in 1,000 market economies fall that far below average by chance. If East Germany landed there, the data hasn't merely failed to support the alternative, it's landed in the opposite tail, and it's completely contradicted, okay? So this is where we're going to find out. Where does communism with East Germany land in this GDP range? Is it somewhere standard? Is it superior? Is it inferior? Now imagine you've got a fertilizer company, okay? And the fertilizer company has made a specific claim in their advertising. Our product increases plant growth. Not just, changes it, but increases it. So now you have a direction, right? You're not watching both ends of the distribution anymore, right? If we go back to this, right? Pretend this is the fertilizer company, right? They're saying our product is increasing plant growth, so it would only be in this tail. If they said it just changes it, it could be in the left tail, could be in the right tail, but they're specifically saying it's increasing it. So we're only looking at the right tail of the distribution now. You're not watching both ends, you're watching the high end because that is the claim you're evaluating. So that makes this a one-tailed test rather than a two-tailed test, okay? So the trade-off is important, it's real, it's permanent. A one-tailed test concentrates your entire rejection region to one side of the distribution rather than both sides. And that makes your cutoff actually less extreme in the predicted direction. The bar is lower, so it's easier to reach significance if your prediction turns out to be right. But if the result lands on the other side, if the fertilizer actually reduces growth, and dramatically so, you can't call that significant because you committed to a direction, right? The commitment is binding. So if it's on this side, you can't say, even though it's really far from average, you said it needed to fall on the right side, okay? So it's really important to decide ahead of time exactly what tail you're going with. Now, with our communism example or the fertilizer example, that's very obvious. For some other things, it may not be obvious. So it just depends on what you're testing for, okay? So most researchers use two-tailed tests as the default for this exact reason. They protect you from surprise. They don't require you to stake your prediction in advance. You use one-tailed when both of the following are true. Your theory makes a genuinely specific directional prediction, and not all theories do. But let's say your theory does actually specify the direction of the prediction, and you're willing to accept that a dramatic result in the other direction won't be significant for your test design. Okay, so you're not just saying something will change; you're saying it's going to change in a specific direction, and you're willing to accept that if it's on the other direction, that it's not going to help you out. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. Okay, so here's how the cutoffs change depending on your choice. So look at what changes between the rows, okay? At alpha equals 0.05, okay, that's our significance level, right? Our threshold of where we're cutting things off. The two-tailed cutoff is at plus or minus 1.96 standard deviation. So you need to land nearly 2 standard deviations from the mean in either direction to reach significance. The one-tailed cutoff at the same alpha is only 1.64 in your predicted direction. So that gap, 1.64 versus 1.96, is kind of the reward for committing to a direction before you see the data. The bar is lower because you've narrowed your prediction. You've made it harder to be right, so we're going to give you a little lower wall to get over. The cost is that the other tail is off the table entirely. If it falls in that other tail, it doesn't support you. It contradicts you. One more thing is that researchers sometimes choose one-tailed tests after seeing which direction the data went and then kind of justify it retroactively. That's not a methodological choice. That's an unethical, intellectually dishonest choice. So that's a method of inflating significance by pretending you predicted something that you didn't. And it's one of the specific practices that produce the replication crisis in psychology that we've talked about. The choice of one-tailed or two-tailed must be made and documented before the data is examined. That's why step 3 comes before step 4 in the 5-step procedure and not after. Now, that doesn't mean that you couldn't, in your discussion section, discuss this finding. It doesn't mean that your research is thrown out the window, but you have to be honest in reporting. So our decision for round 1 is a one-tailed test in the high direction. So here's why, and I want to be precise about the reasoning because it connects to directly how we wrote the hypotheses. So the alternative hypothesis is the communist claim that's stated in its strongest form. Central planning produces superior economic outcomes. That is a high direction prediction to the right, to the right end of the distribution. It says that a centrally planned communist economy lands above market economies on the comparison distribution, not just different from them. Different would be to either side. It would be two-tailed. Above them, that is the specific directional assertion we are testing. Because H1 makes a directional prediction, high, not just different, we use a one-tailed test. The entire 5% rejection region is placed in the right tail, not in both tails, where H1 needs the data to land in order to reject the null. So this is the most generous possible test for the communist claim. To reject the null, to reject capitalism in favor of H1, communism, East Germany only needs to clear one threshold on one side. So a two-tailed test would split the rejection region and make it harder for hypothesis 1 to succeed, for communism to succeed. So we give H1, hypothesis 1, every reasonable advantage, okay? So step 3 is, of course, determining this cutoff. What cutoff are we using? So we could use alpha equals 0.05 or alpha equals 0.01. So we'll just go with 0.05. That's the default. So 0.05, one-tailed in the high direction. And the critical value for a 0.05 alpha test that's one-tailed is positive 1.645, okay? So that's the standard deviations above the mean. So if our z-score exceeds 1.645 standard deviations above the mean, far enough into the right tail, we reject capitalism. We reject the null hypothesis in favor of the alternative hypothesis. The communist claim is supported, at least in this specific claim. If our z-score falls below 1.645, but remains positive or near zero, the null hypothesis is retained. The claim is unconfirmed. It's not falsified, it's just not supported by this specific evidence. If our z-score is negative, the data has moved in the opposite direction from hypothesis 1's prediction entirely. Hypothesis 1 isn't just unconfirmed, it's contradicted, okay? So we set this cutoff now before we look at any data. That's not a formality, it's the whole point of this. Once you've seen the result, you can always construct a rationale for whatever cutoff makes your finding look good. Setting it first is what makes the test mean something. So the cutoff is positive 1.645. It does not change when we see where East Germany lands. Now, notice what happens when the data comes in. If centrally planned economies show superior outcomes, we reject the null. The communist claim is supported. If they show equivalent outcomes, we retain the null. The claim is unconfirmed. If they show inferior outcomes, the data has not merely failed to support hypothesis 1, capitalism. It's landed in the opposite tail from what communism predicted. The claim predicted high, the data landed low. That would be a stronger result than simply failing to reach significance. Okay, it means the hypothesis was not just unconfirmed, it was contradicted. So one more thing, notice that hypothesis 1 states the mechanism, not just the direction. So central planning will produce superior outcomes because it eliminates exploitation, because it allocates, according to people's needs, because it frees people from, frees our motivation from selfishness and profiteering and everything. So the causal mechanism is what makes this a genuine scientific hypothesis rather than a guess. So a mechanism is falsifiable. You can imagine evidence that would contradict it, okay? If a good mechanism, at least. So if the mechanism is wrong, if, for example, the information system required for central planning can't function, under real institutional conditions or whatever, then we can see what the outcome is. We can test it. A mechanism makes specific predictions, and we're going to test some of those. Why alpha 0.05, and where did we find the z-value? Just a reminder in case you're forgetting this from the earlier part of the lecture. Alpha is the threshold that we set for how much risk of being wrong we're willing to accept. Okay? Are you willing to risk being wrong, or is it really important to be right or whatever? So it depends on what you're testing, right? If you're testing a dangerous drug, then that will kill people, you definitely don't want to be wrong. But if you are looking at accidentally convicting innocent people, then you're okay with being wrong. You'd rather be wrong than to convict people who are innocent. So it depends on what you're going for. So specifically, alpha is the probability of making a type 1 error, rejecting the null when the null is actually true, concluding that communism outperforms when it actually doesn't. That would be a false positive. Okay. So setting alpha at 0.05 means we're willing to accept a 5% chance of that error. If the null hypothesis were true, if economic organization made no difference, and we ran this test 100 times on 100 different random samples, we would expect to incorrectly reject the null about 5 times just by chance. That's the risk we are accepting. Now, personally, because I know the history of communism, I would say we should probably do a stricter alpha of 0.01. Okay, but we'll kind of look at both of those. So why 0.05? Why is that the default? Again, because it's just the tradition. Ronald Fisher, a statistician, suggested it as a reasonable threshold. It's roughly 2 standard deviations from the mean. It's a region that's fairly rare, and it kind of just became the default standard across science. Okay, it's not really derived from mathematical principles all that much. It's it's not the only defensible choice. So a lot of fields will use 0.01, which accepts only a 1% false positive risk. And if I was going to say we're going to completely redo our economic system and we're going to take all this risk of switching to communism from capitalism, I would go with more of a 0.01 alpha. Okay, that would be my personal preference. Some use a 0.001 alpha, which actually probably would be my preference even more. So it just sort of depends on how much are you willing to risk getting a false positive. Are you willing to risk a switch to communism even though there's a 5% chance that you're wrong? If you're willing to take that risk, then okay, 0.05 is great. It just depends on what you're willing to risk. Here's how we get from alpha equals 0.05, one-tailed high direction, to z equals 1.645. So a one-tailed test in the high direction places the entire 5% rejection region in the right tail of the comparison distribution. We're asking what z-score cuts off the top 5% of a normal distribution. Everything above that score, that 5%, is the rejection region. Everything below it is in the retention region. Okay. The normal distribution, we know exactly what percentage of scores falls above or below any given z-score. So the z-score that cuts off the top 5%, leaving 95% of the distribution below it and 5% above it, that place is a z-score of 1.645. So you can find this in any standard normal table by looking up the z-score corresponding to a cumulative area of 0.95 or 95% from the left, which leaves 0.05 or 5% in the right tail. That z-score, this is just a z-table thing, is 1.645. So if we'd chosen an alpha of 0.01, which I would prefer instead, accepting only a 1% false positive risk, we would look up the z-score cutting off the top 1% of the distribution, or 99% of everything from the left. Okay, so that z-score would be 2.326, which is a much stricter threshold. It requires a much more extreme result to reject the null hypothesis. If we're running a two-tailed test at an alpha of 0.05, so we're splitting the rejection region equally between the two tails, each tail would contain 2.5%, and we would look up the z-score cutting off 2.5% in each direction. Okay, so, and that z would be 1.96. So the two-tailed threshold is more stringent than the one-tailed threshold because the rejection region on either side is smaller. For this test, one-tailed, high direction, 0.05 alpha. Again, the critical value is 1.645. So East Germany needs to produce a z-score above 1.645 to support the alternative, to support communism, and to reject capitalism. Okay, so we now calculate whether it does or not. So this slide is the pivot point between the setup and the calculation. Okay, everything before this, the hypothesis, the comparison distribution, the cutoff, that was preparation. Step 4 is where you actually run the test. So the z-score answers one question. The z-score we're going to calculate. How many standard deviations away from the center of the comparison distribution does our observation fall? So if East Germany's GDP per capita were right at the Western European mean, again, z would equal 0. That would mean completely typical, exactly what we'd expect if the null hypothesis were true. Okay, if there's no difference between capitalism and communism, so we might as well stick with what we know, capitalism. If z is negative, East Germany fell below that mean. If z is strongly negative, further than our cutoff of negative 1.64, it fell far enough below that we can't explain that gap as random variation. Okay, it's definitely significant. It means something serious if it's that low. So the formula has 3 ingredients, okay, which you've seen all of these already. X is the score we observed, right? East Germany's actual GDP per capita in 1989. Mu is the center of the comparison distribution, the mean GDP per capita across comparable Western European capitalist economies. And sigma is the standard deviation of that comparison distribution. How spread out are those market economies, which was $3,500, right? So the subtraction in the numerator, x minus mu, tells us the raw distance from the center. You should remember this from calculating z-scores, right? So the division by sigma, by the standard deviation, converts that raw distance into a standardized unit, a standard deviation unit, which is what makes the number interpretable and comparable across different situations and different scales. It's what makes the z-score, okay? So that's just a review, so just make sure that you guys remember it. Okay, so the critical value column is the one I want you to look at carefully because it's doing something important here. So hypothesis 1, communism, predicted that central planning, communism, would outperform market economies. That means hypothesis 1, again, is a high direction prediction. It needs East Germany's score to land in the right tail of comparison distribution above the z of 1.645. That is the bar communism has to clear. To support the claim that central planning produces superior outcomes, East Germany needs to be so far above the average market economy, so far above capitalism, that there's less than a 5% chance that gap occurred by chance. Okay, so now let's look at x and mu side by side. So x, East Germany's GDP, is 9,679. That's the GDP per capita in 1989. So this slide is the pivot point between the setup and the calculation. Everything before this, the hypothesis, the comparison distribution, the cutoff, that was preparation. Step 4 is where you actually run the test. So the z-score answers one question. The z-score we're going to calculate. How many standard deviations away from the center of the comparison distribution does our observation fall? So if East Germany's GDP per capita were right at the Western European mean, again, z would equal 0. That would mean, completely typical, exactly what we'd expect if the null hypothesis were true. If there's no difference between capitalism and communism, so we might as well stick with what we know, capitalism. If z is negative, East Germany fell below that mean. If z is strongly negative, further than our cutoff of negative 1.64, it fell far enough below that we can't explain that gap as random variation. Okay? It's definitely significant. It means something serious if it's that low. So the formula has 3 ingredients, okay, which you've seen all of these already. X is the score we observed, right? East Germany's actual GDP per capita in 1989. Mu is the center of the comparison distribution, the mean GDP per capita across comparable Western European capitalist economies. And sigma is the standard deviation of that comparison distribution. How spread out are those market economies, which was $3,500, right? So the subtraction in the numerator, x minus mu, tells us the raw distance from the center. You should remember this from calculating z-scores, right? So the division by sigma, by the standard deviation, converts that raw distance into a standardized unit, a standard deviation unit, which is what makes the number interpretable and comparable across different situations and different scales. It's what makes the z-score, okay? So that's just a review, so just make sure that you guys remember it. Okay, so the critical value column is the one I want you to look at carefully because it's doing something important here. So hypothesis 1, communism, predicted that central planning, communism would outperform market economies. That means hypothesis 1, again, is a high direction prediction. It needs East Germany's score to land in the right tail of comparison distribution above the z of 1.645. That is the bar communism has to clear. To support the claim that central planning produces superior outcomes, East Germany needs to be so far above the average market economy, so far above capitalism, that there's less than a 5% chance that gap occurred by chance. Okay, so now let's look at x and mu side by side. So x, East Germany's GDP, is 9,679. That's the GDP per capita in 1989.
Okay, so I need...
Now let's look at x and mu side by side. So x is East Germany's GDP. Mu is the average GDP of Europe, which I keep talking about all of the European countries, but West Germany's GDP was also about $22,000. Okay, so I should have pointed out because I talked about comparing East Germany and West Germany. So West Germany's average matched the economy of the rest of Europe. Okay, so East Germany's GDP per capita is less than half of the comparison mean. So we haven't done a single calculation yet, but this picture is already pretty obvious, right? The question the math answers is not whether East Germany failed to clear the right tail. That's already obvious. The question is how far the result fell in the wrong direction and whether that distance is large enough to rule out chance entirely. So hypothesis 1, communism, needed the data in the right tail. This is obviously going left, right? And the calculation will tell us exactly how far. Okay, so let's calculate the z-score for East Germany's GDP so that we can see how far East Germany's score is from the center of the comparison distribution, or what we call the raw gap. Okay, so their score is $9,679, and the mu, which is West Germany's GDP and also the rest of Europe's GDP, average GDP, was 22,000 even. Okay, roughly 22,000. So what we're going to do to see that raw gap, to see the difference, is take East Germany's score and minus it from the mu. So we've got 9,679 minus 22,000, and the raw gap is $12,321. So the negative sign, and I should put that there, okay, minus negative $12,321. So the negative sign is telling you something important. East Germany fell below the mean, not above it. So hypothesis 1 predicted that communism would land in the right tail, above the average market economy, above the average capitalist economy. The data is already moving in the opposite direction. So the raw dollar gap is $12,321 below the center of the distribution. We haven't standardized anything yet. We haven't calculated a z-score, but already the result is not just failing to support the communist claim, it's contradicting it. So a result that supported communism, supported hypothesis 1, would have produced a positive number here, a large positive number. East Germany would need to be roughly $5,700 above the mean, about $27,700, just to clear the cutoff of z of 1.645 at an alpha of 0.05. So instead, the raw difference is negative 12,000. So the gap between where hypothesis 1 needed the data to land and where it actually landed isn't just a matter of falling slightly short, it's a matter of being on the wrong side of the distribution entirely. So step 2 will tell us how many standard deviations that gap represents. So now we divide by the standard deviation. So a raw dollar gap is hard to interpret on its own. Is $12,000 a large gap or is it a small one? It depends entirely on how much variation normally exists between the countries. So the standard deviation gives us the unit for answering that question. We're converting the raw gap into a standardized score. How many typical spreads away from average is the result, okay? So z would be, so you've got x minus mu divided by the standard deviation. Okay, and we know the standard deviation is $3,500, so it's 12,321 because we already did this calculation here. So 12,321 divided by $3,500 equals negative 3.52. So East Germany is 3.52 standard deviations below the average of comparable capitalistic economies. Okay, 3.5 standard deviations below West Germany. So let me make sure that number lands in its full weight, because a z-score only means something if you have a feel for the scale. A z-score of 0 means exactly average, right at the center, what we would expect if there's no difference between capitalism and communism. A score of positive 1.645 is the critical value, the threshold, the cutoff that hypothesis 1 that communism needs to clear. That's where East Germany's score would have landed, or higher, to support the communist claim that it outperforms capitalism. A z-score of negative 1 means 1 standard deviation below average, where about 16% of capitalist economies fall this far below the mean naturally, which wouldn't be alarming, wouldn't be bad luck, wouldn't be poor governance, maybe just a rough decade. A z-score of negative 2, which is where we're almost at, means, or we're not even at, we're past that, means 2 standard deviations below average. About 2% of market economies, 2% of capitalistic economies fall this far below. It's just starting to be unusual. Something's probably wrong. A z-score of negative 3 means 3 standard deviations below average. And fewer than 1 in 300 capitalist economies are this far below mean just by chance. Okay, this isn't a bad decade. This is a structural problem. A z-score of negative 3.52 means East Germany sits in the extreme lower tail of the distribution, a place almost no capitalist economy, no matter how poorly managed, ever reaches by chance. In a normal distribution, approximately 99.98% of all scores will fall within 3.5 standard deviations of the mean. East Germany was in the bottom fraction of a percent. So, okay, hold the full picture. Hypothesis 1 needed z 1.645 or higher in the right tail. The data produced a z of negative 3.52, deep into the left tail. The distance between where Hypothesis 1 predicted the data would land and where it actually landed isn't a matter of just falling slightly short of the cutoff. It's a matter of being on the wrong side of the distribution by more than 5 standard deviations. Okay, that's not a below average result. That's a result so far from what the hypothesis predicted that something structural, not chance, not bad luck, not poor implementation by just one leader, has to explain, okay? It's significant. It's extremely significant. All right, step 3, compare the z-score to the critical value. So we set a threshold before we look at any data, right? The critical value is that threshold expressed as a z-score. If our observed z-score clears it and lands more extreme in the predicted direction, we would reject the null, right? So again, critical value of 1.645, our observed value is negative 3.52. Okay, does negative 3.52 exceed 1.645 in the predicted direction? No, of course, not even close. So I don't want to keep going over this over and over again, but, to be precise, what this means is we do not reject the null in favor of hypothesis 1. We do not reject, with this data, now there's lots of other data to test, but with this specific data, we don't reject capitalism in favor of communism. Communism, hypothesis 1, the data doesn't support the claim that it makes, it contradicts it. So the result isn't inconclusive. It's not a case of failing to reach significance. The data pointed in the opposite direction by an enormous margin. Okay, so we do not reject the null hypothesis. Hypothesis 1 is not supported. The data contradicts hypothesis 1. So the z-score answered one question: is this result statistically significant? Is it unlikely enough that we can rule out chance? And the answer is yes. But statistical significant answers only half the question. It tells you that the result is real. It doesn't tell you how big the difference is. So a study with a huge sample can find a statistically significant result that's so tiny it has no practical meaning. A drug that lowers blood pressure by 0.1 points on a 200-point scale might be statistically significant with enough participants, but it's not treatment worth prescribing. It's not worth the money. It's not worth the side effects. So Cohen's d is the effect size. It measures how large the actual difference is in standardized units that let you compare the size of effects from different studies, across different studies, different measurements, different scales, okay? Because it is a z-score. All right, so Cohen's d is so confusing because it's presented like it's something entirely different from a z-score, and it's not. It is the z-score, okay? It even gives you the Cohen's d formula, okay, which is d equals x minus mu over sigma, which is how you calculate the z-score, okay? So Cohen's d is the z-score. It's identical to the z-score formula, and the numbers are the same. Okay, they're exactly the same. I know they're presented like they're totally different, and you're supposed to memorize the formula for both. And with Cohen's d, it's d equals the formula rather than z equals the formula, but it's the same formula. Okay, but we're just looking at it a little bit differently. So z-score, you say, okay, the z-score means the result's significant or not. But now, what is the significance of the z-score? And then we call it the Cohen's d. Okay, so the Cohen's d is the same exact score as the z-score, negative 3.52. But what we do is we look at what does that mean. Okay, so the negative sign versus a positive sign means that the score's below average. Positive means the score's above average. This shouldn't be a surprise to you at this point. Okay. But then how big is the number? Okay, so Cohen, Jacob Cohen, he was a statistician who he specialized in studying the sizes of effects. And what he found with studying all of these research projects was that the Cohen's D, the size of the Z-score, really did mean something about how powerful it was. So he found if the Z-score, or in this case the D-score, was 0.2, it was a small effect, okay? So, like, for instance, the height difference between a 15-year-old and a 16-year-old. Yes, it's immeasurably different. It's significantly different. But it's not something that you would notice if you're standing in a room. That, oh, look how tall that person is. They must be 15 years old, not 16 years old. You're not going to notice that. A 5-year-old to a 16-year-old, yeah, you'll notice that difference. Okay. A D of 0.5, or a Z-score of 0.5, is positive or minus, is a medium effect. So the difference in the IQ scores of a normal person versus somebody with a brain injury. That's detectable. That's meaningful. A D of 0.8 is a large effect size. So Cohen described this as the kind of difference visible to the naked eye, the kind you would notice without needing a study to tell you that it's there. So that's a large effect. Now, a D of 3.52 doesn't even fit on this scale. It's more than 4 times what Cohen called large. Most researchers working in social sciences will never even see an effect size this large in their entire career. Okay, so those two distributions, East Germany's economic performance versus West Germany and the rest of Western Europe's economic performance, barely overlap at all. That is an enormous Cohen's D, an enormous effect size. Okay? And again, just to reinforce this, the formula for Cohen's D is exactly the same formula for the Z-score. You don't need to memorize a new formula. You just have to put a D instead of a Z. You can see in this chart the distribution between East Germany and West Germany, barely even touching. There's such little overlap between these two distributions. It's obvious that they're significantly different and powerfully significantly different. Okay? So it's just an illustration of what we're seeing with that difference in distributions. Okay, and this is the whole thing of what we're doing with comparison testing, is we're comparing these distributions. Okay, hypothesis testing. This is what all statistics is about, is saying we expect this, but we got this. Is that a significant gap or not? That is what statistics is in a nutshell. So one result could be a fluke. Okay, maybe there's just something weird about East Germany. Maybe it was because the Russians were in charge. I don't know. Maybe it was just the year that it started. Who knows? Okay. But if you see a pattern across many independent cases, it's not. And we do see this ability to replicate with all communist countries. Venezuela has the world's largest oil reserves, more than Saudi Arabia, but its GDP contracted by 59% in 5 years under communism. Okay, that's a huge reduction in their GDP. The Great Depression was the worst economic collapse in American history. The U.S. only lost 27% of its GDP across the entire decade of the 1930s. Venezuela's contraction was roughly 3 times worse than that in a fraction of the time. Okay, in a country sitting on the world's largest oil reserves. They should have been so wealthy. North Korea's GDP per capita today is approximately 1/54th of South Korea's. Same peninsula, same genetic people, same culture. Again, randomly divided just like East and West Germany. 1/54th of South Korea's GDP. So every communist economy examined shows the same direction, different continents, different cultures, different leaders, different time periods, the same result. So we ran one formal calculation that established the procedure. The pattern across independent cases establishes the conclusion, right? So how would we say this in APA format? This is the final step, and this is important, okay? So you might say it's something like East Germany's GDP per capita in 1989 was significantly below, and that was set, whether it was significant or not, because of that 5% threshold, the alpha equals 0.05. It was significantly below the mean of comparable Western European market economies, okay? Now, I guess I put 0.01 into this, okay? So at 0.01, it's still significant. Okay, negative 3.52 is not only significant at an alpha of 0.05, it's significant at an alpha of 0.01, and it's significant at an alpha of 0.01, which is pretty phenomenal. Okay, so the data does not support hypothesis 1, the hypothesis that central planning or communism produces superior economic welfare outcomes. The result falls in the opposite tail from the one H1 predicted. That would be a proper APA format of stating your conclusion. So this test taught us 3 things about hypothesis testing. 1, directional hypotheses require one-tailed tests. If there's not a predicted direction, you do 2-tailed tests. Okay. 2 is statistical significance does not necessarily equal practical importance. Okay, a Z of negative 3.52 tells us the result is not due to chance, but the Cohen's D of 3.52 tells us that the power of that Z score is enormous. Okay, so both numbers, even though it's the same exact number, both numbers are required for a complete interpretation. So a result can be statistically significant, but it can, in practical terms, in power terms, be really small. Okay? So a result can can also be statistically significant and enormously powerful, which it is in this case. Okay, this one is both. The third thing we learned is that effect size benchmarks gives you the context. So a Cohen's d of 0.2, 0.5, 0.8, those are Cohen's anchors for small, medium, and large effects in social science research. Okay? A d of 3.52 is off that scale entirely. But without that benchmark, a reader of your research, or you, if you're reading other people's research, might not know how to interpret the number. With it, they understand immediately that this isn't a large effect, this is a huge effect. Okay, it's a result in a category where we don't even have benchmarks because effects of this size almost never appear in social science literature. All right, so this video is long enough. I actually have a few other tests to go through that we're going to go through more significantly. So I will have a third video with those other tests. You don't have to watch them, but if you're confused by this process, I do suggest you watch them. And if you're interested in testing a few other variables with communism, then feel free to join us in that next video. All right, so I hope you learned, and if you have any questions, send me a message.